Hello, everyone. This is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas. And if you like it, please check out my other videos on my channel page where you can see what YouTube might not be suggesting to you. Language, Truth, and Logic by Alfred Jules Ayer is one of those books that is sympathetic to those who feel that philosophy goes wrong in creating highfalutin speculation about some ultimate reality. Such speculation often seems fanciful and unfruitful. And so Ayer proposes the question of the proper purpose and method of philosophy. In his view, if we want philosophy to produce some kind of knowledge, we must abandon the presumption that we can have knowledge of a transcendent reality, something that is beyond the experiences of our senses, and focus on something else instead. For those of you who may not be very familiar with analytic philosophy, this is also a great first book to allow you an entry point into it. In discussing it, I will focus mostly on the purpose and method of philosophy and its criterion of belief. I will also give some discussion of the application of these ideas to issues of ethics, the self, and the common world. As for the questions of how we can know that we cannot know a transcendent reality, Ayer adopts the skepticism of David Hume. He cites and will defend the doctrine that is commonly known as Hume's fork, which states his position on the impossibility of metaphysics, where impossibility means impossibility of knowing things with any certainty. Hume ends his inquiry concerning human understanding with a famous statement. He says, "If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." What Hume does is to draw a distinction among propositions that can be known to be true. They contain either a relation of ideas or a matter of fact. Propositions that have relations of ideas expressed in the subject and predicate terms, such as a triangle is a three-sided figure or a horse is a mammal, are known to be true due to the relation of the subject and predicate ideas. It is a question of language to see that these propositions must be true because they express something that we mean by the term triangle or horse, and it would create a contradiction to deny them. They are effectively tautologies, saying that a triangle is a triangle and a horse is a horse. In Hume's view that Ayer will seek to defend, propositions of arithmetic and geometry are of this type. By contrast, matter-of-fact propositions that do not express something about language, such as there is an oak tree in Johnson's backyard, are only known to be true by sense experience. However, this is only known to be true of a particular instance. Even regarding arithmetical propositions, we can take 3 of any one thing, add another 2 to them, count the total, and see that it makes 5 of those things. But the general proposition that 2 plus 3 equals 5 can only be known in advance by the meaning of the terms. The idea here is that the union of 2 and 3 is in a relation of ideas with our concept of 5. It is another tautology. The upshot of this regarding metaphysical propositions that state claims about God, free will, immortality, the existence of body or soul, mind and matter, is that these propositions are not of either kind. They are not relations of ideas that can be known by the usage of the terms in language, or by expressing mathematical reasoning of quantity and number. They also cannot be empirically verified, and that is why I commit them to the flames. Ayer will go beyond the command to cast it into the flames and argue that propositions that are neither tautologies nor matters of fact are not significant, that they speak nonsense. In doing so, he is also going beyond other analytic philosophers outside the Vienna circle of logical positivists that included Ayer. For other analytic philosophers outside of that school, metaphysical propositions do not become meaningless simply by virtue of them not being provable. However, Ayer wants to specifically have a rule that is from language, without any psychology of mind that would make a belief meaningful. For a rule to determine literal significance, we need only formulate a criterion for expressions about matters of fact. He wants to ensure that he does not have a complicated psychology, or worse yet, create a contradiction by having his elimination of metaphysics based on a metaphysic of his own. Ayer is confident that a criterion can be found that avoids these difficulties. And he says, our charge against the metaphysician is not that he attempts to employ the understanding in a field where it cannot profitably venture, but that he produces sentences which fail to conform to the conditions under which alone a sentence can be literally significant. Nor are we ourselves obliged to talk nonsense in order to show that all sentences of a certain type are necessarily devoid of literal significance. The criterion to test the genuineness of apparent statements of fact is the criterion of verifiability. And he says about it, we say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person, if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows what observations would lead him, under certain conditions, to accept the proposition as being true or reject it as being false. And so, if a proposition is not a tautology, and also at least not in theory verifiable, then it is a pseudo-proposition. It may express something emotionally significant to us, but it is not literally significant. As for the idea of a proposition being verifiable in theory, Ayer recognizes that some propositions, such as a statement about the mountains on the far side of the moon, may express something that we would know in theory how to empirically verify, but cannot do so in practice. In this case, we have a proposition that is what he calls verifiable in principle, as opposed to being practically verifiable. The principle of verifiability will count both as being significant. An example Ayer gives of a proposition not counting as significant is Hegel's statement that the absolute enters into, but is itself incapable of, evolution and progress. This is not even verifiable in principle, because no conceivable observation will indicate its truth or falsity. Metaphysical questions in general become insignificant by this criterion. No observations can settle issues such as whether the external world is real or whether there is only one substance or many. We cannot even establish a probability test for which to believe, and thus metaphysical questions are ruled out. This appears simple when applied to particular propositions that we can verify by sense experience. But in our everyday lives, we also formulate historical and universal propositions. When we say that all men are mortal, Ayer does not want to render such propositions insignificant simply because we cannot verify it with certainty. No amount of observation can prove with certainty that a universal proposition will be valid regarding future instances. Therefore, Ayer rejects the idea of demanding a strict verifiability. Instead, he will say that verifiability can have a weaker sense, where a proposition gets accepted on the basis of its probability of being true. It will be sufficient that the proposition records an actual or possible observation, and when it does, Ayer calls it an experimental proposition. When an experimental proposition can be in conjunction with certain other premises, the criterion will not deny significance to universal and historical propositions. Much of the first three chapters of Language, Truth, and Logic focuses on language. In Ayer's view, confusion about language is at the root of many metaphysical systems that have been created. Much of the confusion has to do with existence. The propositions martyrs suffer and martyrs exist appear to be propositions of the same type, and this leads us to a belief in subsistent entities. To clarify this, existence is not a predicate or an attribute. We say nothing about a subject when asserting its existence alone. We do not then describe it, ascribe a property to it, or differentiate it from anything else that might also exist. It does not necessitate that the subject named must exist in some sense. This creates a situation in the minds of Ayer and other analytic philosophers where it is proper to say that something described exists, rather than to say that something named exists. For instance, instead of saying that J.K. Rowling exists, it is more proper to say that the author of the Harry Potter books exists. When we attach a predicate to a thing, we imply its existence. But if existence were a predicate, any proposition asserting the existence of anything would be a tautology. The confusion of language Ayer believes to be behind metaphysics also revolves around the idea of substance, usually defined as a thing that can continue to exist separate from and independently of whatever other thing brought it into existence. He says the problem is that we cannot in our language refer to the properties of a thing without introducing a word or phrase that appears to stand for the thing itself. Then a distinction is made between the properties and the thing, leading philosophers to assume that there must be a real entity of some kind, if only fictional, corresponding to the name. Ayer's way of avoiding this metaphysical assumption in his analysis will be the position of phenomenalism associated with George Berkeley. The idea that Berkeley proposed is that the thing constitutes that bundle of reliable sensations that we experience, and that it is to that bundle that we give a name. An apple, for instance, we will regard as being the sight, smell, feel, taste, and the satisfying crunch when I bite into it. We withhold judgment about the issue of whether there exists a physical apple outside of these sensations, although Berkeley denied its physical existence. This will avoid deception by grammar and errors in reasoning. Ayer's version of Berkeley's theory takes the form of saying that the thing is a logical construct out of the bundle of sense contents that reliably accompany each other, rather than the bundle itself that Berkeley claims to be put into our minds directly by God. What he means by the thing being a logical construct is that all sentences referring to the thing are translatable into sentences referring to the sense contents. Despite the similarity of names, this phenomenalism is not the same thing as phenomenology associated with, for instance, Edmund Husserl. Ayer, the phenomenalist, is not in search of any kind of science of consciousness. With the foregoing, Ayer considers it unnecessary and unfruitful to seek to construct a system of philosophy from first principles. These principles can only be found in laws of nature that are themselves hypotheses. René Descartes had attempted to derive knowledge from a principle that he considered to be absolutely certain. In his famous line of cogito ergo sum from his Meditations, or Je pense donc je suis from the Discourse of Method, or I think therefore I am in English, he professed to prove that his own existence could not be doubted. In Ayer's view, it was a psychology that he was constructing. That there are thoughts does not demonstrate the continuing existence of a self. One thought does not point to another. Therefore, Descartes' attempt to base a deductive system on something intrinsically given like this is bound to fail. The other alternative would be to try to derive a world view from tautologies. But tautologies can only be used to derive further tautologies. This procedure cannot tell us the whole truth about the universe. The conclusion that seems to follow is that we cannot derive knowledge of the world, or construct a study of reality as a whole from first principles. It would also start with the unprovable assumption that reality as a whole is somehow different from reality investigated piecemeal. The alternative Ayer proposes is to have philosophy study the truth of sciences, with no object outside of them, rather than being considered a source of speculative knowledge. The point will be to have the proper business of the philosopher be to assist the scientific community by clarifying the terms being used. In well-developed sciences such as physics, one might argue that they don't need philosophers to do that work for them. Near the end of the book, Ayer states that psychology will have more of a need for analysis of its concepts and language. Its function becomes wholly critical and will consist in creating a criterion for truth value. It will be a question of what we will accept as evidence for a given empirical proposition. It is here where Ayer's notion of philosophy serving the sciences is what puts him in conflict with philosophers of his time in continental Europe. Phenomenologists and existentialists tacitly accept a more traditional idea of the role of philosopher as someone who picks up where science leaves off and pursues the questions that science cannot presently answer, which can include ethics, the human condition, and internal consciousness. As for the so-called problem of induction, we regard the sciences as respectful without this problem being first solved. The problem of induction, simply put, is that general rules cannot be inferred with absolute certainty from any number of particular instances of their operation. We cannot know in advance that instance number n plus 1 will follow the pattern. In Ayer's view, we are nevertheless justified in our faith in science insofar as it continues doing what it is designed to do, to allow us to predict events and control the environment. We should not expect the validity of induction to be proven. It would only beg the question if we tried to derive it from some empirical principle anyway. Instead, we will have as a pragmatic justification the idea that the test of a science will be its success in practice. Given these facts about induction and the barrenness of trying to derive a philosophical system from first principles, the thing left over for it to be the business of the philosopher is the task of defining rationality. And this is something traditionally disregarded by philosophers who wanted to concentrate on epistemology, or theory of knowledge, as a starting point. For Descartes, as an example, the first question was what I know with certainty and how. As for material things, the philosopher gives a definition in terms of sensations, rather than seeking proof of judgments based on perception. The object for Ayer, the thing he could otherwise be accused of taking as a given, will be related to that bundle of sensations that reliably accompany each other. Whether or not there exists a physical thing apart from these sensations will not be the business of the philosopher to investigate. Ayer saw this phenomenalism of Berkeley as a form of analysis, showing that the history of philosophy is not entirely the history of metaphysics. He discusses other British philosophers going back into the 17th century to show that an analytic standpoint has always been at least implicit in British philosophy. Analysis will not be what it has been for metaphysicians of the past. It does not involve breaking up of objects into constituent parts to get at base particulars. The idea that the universe is an aggregate of particulars is a metaphysical proposition. Analysis will not be concerned with the physical properties of things either. It will instead be an analysis of the way we speak about things. It will have a linguistic rather than a factual object. The question of what is an X is the request for a definition of a particular sort. What analysis will do is to define a sentence in use by means of something synonymous with it that will allow for an analysis of its truth-value claims. Russell's theory of the so-and-so is an example. Under Russell's theory, explained in his 1905 paper on denoting, to say that the F is G is to make claims that there exists one and only one F such that it is G. This is a threefold claim of existence, uniqueness, and predication. Other propositions that don't have a the might make less than three claims. If I say, the author of Waverley was Scotch, Russell's actual analysis of it, that Ayer admits he got wrong in his book, is that it is equivalent to a conjunction of three propositions, that at least one person wrote Waverley, at most one person wrote Waverley, and whoever wrote Waverley was Scotch. If I say the round square cannot exist, it is a claim that no one thing can be both round and square. The purpose of these philosophical definitions will be to dispel confusions that arise from an imperfect understanding of certain types of sentences. A philosophical elucidation of any language involves enumerating the type of sentences that are significant. Symbols may be said to be of the same type when they can be substituted one for another. A system of definitions in use reveals the structure of the language, whether verbal or written. The problem that this is intended to solve is the problem of fictitious objects, where one thing is the subject of a sentence, but we do not want to assume that there must exist some corresponding object. A logical construction will not be a fictitious object in any sense, like the English state or Hamlet. When we are dealing with an object, the analysis will be a construction that is a linguistic rather than a factual assertion. A table will be a symbol standing for sense contents in usage. The structure will be altered such that table and the sense contents are not really substitutes for each other outside of this context. Ayer tells us that this, as we have seen, is tantamount to saying that sentences which contain the symbol table, or the corresponding symbol in any language which has the same structure as English, can all be translated into sentences of the same language, which do not contain that symbol, nor any of its synonyms, but do contain certain symbols which stand for sense contents. A fact which may be loosely expressed by saying that to say anything about a table is always to say something about sense contents. So the original sentence has to be altered in order to perform this function, but it is still only a function of a definition in use. Ayer wants to stress his definition of use language because he wants to avoid his readers thinking that it is a matter of defining a symbol like table in terms of symbols that stand for sense contents. It will not be a definition, and the alteration will also not constitute the meaning. At this point, it may seem like Ayer is drifting away from a description of analysis that is different in appearance from the paradigm examples. Ayer's examples from Russell involve uses of the same terms, and he does not give examples of analysis with a different word to stand for the sense contents that is not even a synonym. However, when we do the translation, the way to think about it is still to regard it as looking into the truth value claims, and that in doing so, we do not intend to make a metaphysical claim of the reality of a thing based on its sense contents. Ayer now moves on to the problem of perception. This is the problem of showing how statements about material things are related to observation statements. It is a question of how we have an actual rule for translating sentences about a material thing into sentences about sense contents, or a question of reduction of material things to sense contents. Ayer continues his linguistic rather than factual theme of analysis into his examination of things and their qualities. He regards it as a mistake to describe the nature of a material thing as if it were the answer to a factual question. What we do then is to recognize the problem as being about relations of symbols rather than the properties denoted by them. In my earlier example of an apple, I noted that it engages all five senses. The question can then be asked about what causes me to believe that those sense contents apply to the same one thing. The nature of the material thing will become the relations that must hold between any two sense contents for them to be elements of the same material thing. The rule proposed by Ayer is that two sense contents are elements of the same thing, if and only if they are related by direct or indirect resemblances or direct or indirect continuity. We then seek to show a correlation between different sense contents that may be of different types, for example, tactile and visual. In the introduction to the second edition, Ayer concedes that it is impossible to create a definition of a material thing by creating a method of translating statements about a material thing into observation statements. It is because no finite number of observation statements can be equivalent to a material thing. Instead, we seek to construct a schema that shows the sort of relations that must obtain between sense contents for it to be true that a given thing exists. We also need a way to deal with qualities of a thing. We say that a certain quality is a real quality of a given thing when it characterizes those elements which are most conveniently measured. Ayer's example for illustration is the roundness of a coin. It will mean only that roundness of shape that characterizes those elements of the coin experienced from the point of view from which it is most conveniently measured. Likewise, the color of a thing is most conveniently discerned and measured under optimal lighting conditions. Relations of quality or position between material things can then be defined in terms of the relations that obtain between the privileged elements. The goal of this analysis of the material thing is to have a similar effect as the definitions of descriptive phrases. It is to increase our understanding of the sentences in which we refer to the material things and to dispel confusion that can lead to an unwarranted metaphysical belief. After explaining the principle of verification in Chapter 1, Ayer proceeded to go directly into his theory of the proper function of philosophy and the nature of logical analysis in the next two chapters. In Chapter 4, he returns to the original theme of verification to deal with the challenge to Hume's fork raised by Immanuel Kant in his 1781 Critique of Pure Reason. Hume's fork has relations of ideas that are true by definition and known independently of sense experience. His matters of fact are propositions that are not true by definition and require sense experience for verification. Kant divides the two questions that Hume packed into one. In Kant's terms, a judgment is analytic when the concept of the predicate is part of the concept of the subject, such that we can say that the predicate is contained in the subject. A judgment is synthetic when the predicate adds something not already thought in our conception of the subject. As to how we know a judgment to be true, we say that we know it a priori, if we know it independently of sense experience or prior to the object being given in experience. An a posteriori judgment can only be known by being verified by sense experience. Translating Hume's language into Kant's, relations of ideas are analytic a priori, and matters of fact are synthetic a posteriori. For our purposes here, the fact that Kant talks about judgments rather than propositions will not be important. The reason why he does it is because he wants to emphasize that his work is about mental activity and not its products. According to Ayer, except for tautologies, there are no significant propositions that are not empirical hypotheses, verifiable at least in theory by a possible sense experience. This is contrary to Kant's claims that there are synthetic a priori judgments that are known to be true, and the question of how we can know them with certainty is his explanation of what the Critique of Pure Reason is to explain. Here, Ayer explicitly defines his logical empiricism as the doctrine that a synthetic a priori judgment or proposition is impossible, meaning unknowable, not significant, not meaningful. This involves the further idea of a strict distinction between truths that are about language, that are known independently of sense experience, and truths that are about the world, that require a possible sense experience to verify. Regarding the idea of any proposition being necessarily true, Ayer's theory is that we can only ever establish a logical necessity and never a metaphysical necessity. Kant asserts that there are truths known independently of sense experience that are about the world rather than language and known without analysis of the subject and predicate concepts. Kant submits that propositions of arithmetic, as well as many propositions in geometry and natural science, such as all bodies are heavy, are examples of synthetic judgments a priori. Ayer admits that if Kant is correct, then these propositions would constitute truths about the world that are known about the world but not by sense experience. This would also effectively indicate that some properties can be ascribed to all objects without observing that all objects have them. For Ayer to continue to deny that there are any truths of reason that refer to or establish matters of fact, he must show either that these truths are not really true with necessity or that they are not about the world. He will proceed to argue that they are relations of ideas and that they are not about the world, and suggest an explanation of how Kant was led into error. Kant argued that 7 plus 5 equals 12 must be synthetic because we do not think 12 when we think the union of 7 and 5. Maybe not, but Ayer argues that this does not prove that the proposition can be denied without contradiction. Much of the Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead is concerned with demonstrating the counting principle, that 1 plus 1 equals 2, which forms the basis of arithmetic going beyond mere addition. If the equation involves large numbers that would require calculation, the wrong answer can still be a contradiction, even if we do not immediately detect it. The problem with Kant's theory is that he effectively has two separate definitions of an analytic judgment that Ayer claims to not be equivalent to each other. Kant judges 7 plus 5 equals 12 to be synthetic because he does not think the union of 7 and 5 when he thinks of 12. He also regards all bodies are heavy to be synthetic based on the law of contradiction alone, meaning that we can deny it without contradiction. Kant switches back and forth between a logical criterion and a psychological one. According to Ayer, when we make an arithmetical error, even when we do not have enough fingers and toes to calculate, we create a contradiction without knowing it. As for geometry, Ayer argues that non-Euclidean geometries show that all that is required for a valid geometry is that we stick to the logical consequences of our definitions. Geometries are valid if they are free of contradictions. In Kant's time and before, geometry was thought to be about the properties of physical space. If we accept that it is about the properties of space, we may be inclined to believe Kant's theory that space is the form of intuition of outer sense, meaning that space becomes a necessary background in which an object must be apprehended, if it is to be apprehended at all. Instead, it turns out that we can use geometry to reason about space, but it is an empirical question whether it can be applied to an object of experience. The question ends up being beyond the boundary of geometry alone. And so Ayer says that all that the geometry itself tells us is that if anything can be brought under the definitions, it will also satisfy the theorems. It is therefore a purely logical system, and its propositions are purely analytic propositions. Most of the time, I save critical comments to the end, but to avoid having these technicalities forgotten, I will step in now to defend Kant. His answer to the question of how contradictions get created when we deny analytic judgments is the predicate being contained in the subject. It is not two different definitions. In explaining why we should believe a relation of ideas to be true, Hume, Ayer, or anyone else will do the same thing. It is the way it is taught that a triangle is a three-sided figure is something to be believed because it creates a contradiction to deny it. How does its denial involve a contradiction? It is because a three-sided figure is what we mean when we call something a triangle, or in other words, the predicate is contained in the subject. Regarding arithmetical propositions, Hume argued as part of his general skepticism in his treatise of human nature that even here we can have doubts on the grounds that we can never be totally certain that our calculations are correct and cannot recalculate to infinity. I would argue that Hume was inconsistent, correct here in the treatise and wrong in the inquiry about arithmetical propositions being relations of ideas. What Ayer, in his defense of Hume, is really doing here is to introduce the idea that at least some propositions are analytic in an omniscient mind and not in ours. He does say that, quote, a being whose intellect was infinitely powerful would take no interest in logic and mathematics, for he would be able to see at a glance everything that his definitions implied, unquote. So why not say that a proposition can be synthetic for us and analytic for God? For now, I will say that it has to do with Ayer not wanting anything psychological, let alone metaphysical, in his system. What Ayer is thinking to be the strength of his argument is the analogy between logic and arithmetic. He rightly notes that logical proofs ultimately show that some conclusion following from the premises cannot be denied without contradiction. The lines of a proof show by the accepted rules and conventions of the language that one or more previous lines imply the inference drawn, such that the proposition that the conclusion drawn is implied by the premises cited is analytic. For example, on line 5, I know, having learned the rule of disjunctive syllogism as a paradigm, that it creates a tautology to say that Q or R along with not Q implies R. This remains true even though the rule is usually stated as being that when given a disjunction and the negation of one of the disjuncts, I can infer the other disjunct. What a formal proof effectively proves is that to draw the negation of the stated conclusion from those premises would create a contradiction somewhere. In my presentation on truth trees, I show how to identify the contradiction that would exist by the abbreviated tree method. A multiplication, however, has no such justifications and is not immediately obvious to anyone familiar with numbers at any point. As Hume noted, we can only gain confidence by rechecking, but cannot do so to infinity. In formal logic, I do immediately see it, while at the same time I use a calculator to check my multiplication answer before making this part of my presentation. So what I am saying here is that Ayer's analogy between logic and arithmetic does not fly. Ayer does not deal with all of Kant's examples of synthetic judgments a priori. Kant also says, quote, that the straight line between 2 points is the shortest is a synthetic proposition. For my concept straight contains nothing of quantity, but only of quality, unquote. Ayer also does not deal with Kant's geometry example involving triangles that we can never make one of the lines a greater length than the sum of the other two. If we examine triangles, we could reduce the height and thus bring the sum of the other two sides closer to that of the base. The other two sides equal the base when it becomes 3 straight lines on a pile. But we can never get the other two sides to add up to something less than the base. Kant's position is that we cannot prove this using solely analytic propositions. In addition to definitions, we would also need axioms that are ultimately synthetic. Moving on now to Ayer's chapter 5 about truth and probability, what is left to be done is to formulate some criterion of belief that will not only justify our belief in science, but also apply to empirical propositions and general propositions based on observations. One might think that what is needed is a definition of truth, but Ayer argues that this is yet another confusion of language. When we say that P is true, P is really all that we are asserting, and this is true has no separate meaning. So truth itself will not be something we can analyze in its concept in terms of any real quality or relation. Instead, what really matters is the conditions under which P is true or false, which will be a question of how propositions are validated. According to Ayer, synthetic propositions always have something descriptive about them, and therefore are not simply a recording of sense experience alone. A proposition that this is white makes a claim that the thing under consideration is similar to other things. This claim may be doubted without contradiction, but the sensation itself is still a given. A synthetic proposition is an empirical hypothesis that is confirmed or denied in actual experience. In theory, propositions that describe observations are themselves hypotheses, but in practice, we regard certain types of observations as trustworthy. The justification will be from a pragmatic standpoint. Regarding general truths that are matters of fact occurring in sense experience, we will be able to generate certain laws. Ayer tells us that when one speaks of hypotheses being verified in experience, it is important to bear in mind that it is never just a single hypothesis, which an observation confirms or discredits, but always a system of hypotheses. Suppose that we have devised an experiment to test the validity of a scientific law. The law states that in certain conditions, a certain type of observation will always be forthcoming. Under this scenario, the law can be confirmed or denied by an experience that conforms to these conditions or not. Other than this, all we need to have is a system that is free of contradictions. The pragmatic justification for empirical propositions, be they particular or generalizations, such as all men are mortal, will run along the same line as the justification for our belief in science based on its success. We want to have a system that allows us to anticipate the course of our sensations. And so we accept that system that allows us to make accurate predictions. Therefore, the system of hypotheses is really a set of rules which govern our expectations of future experiences. It can also be related to our simple desires, such as survival. This also explains why the conclusion of an unsuccessful experiment may cause us to alter our system in the hope of making whatever system we adopt more effective in anticipating future experiences. These considerations allow us to now formulate a criterion for the validity of an empirical proposition. The criterion will not supply us with absolute proof, because a future observation may contradict an empirical hypothesis, but it will tell us when a probability is increased. The probability will not be a property of a proposition or a relation, but is instead a question of functionality. As in the sciences, the hypothesis to accept is the one that serves its function of allowing us to anticipate future experiences. This increases our confidence in it. Allowing our beliefs to be determined in this way is what we commonly call rationality. We would otherwise have no standard of rationality. This applies to all empirical propositions, singular, particular, or universal. Every synthetic proposition is effectively a rule for anticipation of experience. Ayer also has this applied to historical propositions. In his view, the objection that historical propositions should not be counted in this way possibly assumes that history is something that is objectively there, and that we need to have our opinions about it correspond to something real. The question remains about how to apply this philosophy to the realm of ethics and other areas. Statements of value are synthetic and do not provide any prediction about the course of sensations. Ayer regards those statements to be expressions related to emotions that are neither true nor false. He says that the different moral theories that have been produced are also apt to contain pieces of metaphysics. The theories have often failed to distinguish between actual ethical judgments and exhortations to virtue, definitions of ethical terms, and descriptions of moral experience. In Ayer's view, only definitions of ethical terms can be said to constitute ethical philosophy. Moral commands are not propositions at all, and the phenomenon of moral experience is the proper subject of psychology or sociology. As for ethical judgments, assertions that an act is right or wrong, they do not seem different from factual assertions. It is not self-contradictory to assert that an action that has general approval is not right or not good. It is also not self-contradictory to say that it is wrong to do what would lead to the greatest happiness to the greatest number, contrary to the standard of right conduct proclaimed by utilitarians. As such, all ethical propositions are synthetic. In terms of verifying an ethical proposition, we are left in the dark because we have no test for empirically verifying statements of value. What we can verify by experience is what pleases us, or what we desire psychologically. But in terms of analysis, X is pleasant, or X is desired, is not equivalent to X is good. In the conventions of our language, Statements of value cannot be reduced to factual statements about the world. If I say that stealing is wrong, I produce a sentence that has no factual meaning. This is Ayer's version of the fact-value dichotomy, that a statement of what is cannot establish a statement of what ought to be. In the end, it becomes a matter of personal preference and a desire to have that preference shared by others. Normative ethical terms like wrong are emotive and are often also calculated to arouse feeling and stimulate action. Statements about a duty also involve commands. We can therefore define ethical statements in terms of both expressions of feeling and the different responses that they are calculated to provoke. As for those statements themselves, Ayer says that in practice, people do not express disagreement with each other about the values, but about the facts. If someone argues against a moral judgment, he does not actually produce an argument intending to prove without facts that the moral feeling expressed is itself invalid. We argue instead that people are mistaken about facts. For example, if you say that patience is a virtue, I might argue that it is a vice with statements about how tolerating some other person's vices might lead to certain consequences that I do not want. The statement about virtue or vice becomes a statement about preference, with facts used to try to persuade others to adopt that preference. It is not different from declaring that you like chocolate ice cream while I prefer vanilla. On the basis of this, as well as his logical empiricism in general, Ayer concludes that ethical concepts are pseudo-concepts and are unanalyzable. It is only a question of what moral habits exist within a group or an individual. This is a matter for the psychologist or sociologist. The same applies to aesthetic judgments of what is beautiful. And now, with its ethical as well as metaphysical components, theology is also shown to be something nonsensical. One might wonder at this point whether Ayer sees his empiricism as also excluding belief in the self and other minds. He goes into these in Chapter 7, with arguments to conclude that I constitute a self and that I am not alone. As for material objects, I have already mentioned his acceptance of a form of Berkeley's phenomenalism. He regards a material thing as a logical construct out of a bundle of sense contents. If the bundle of sense contents has existence as sense contents, it would be a different kind of existence than what is asserted when someone claims that an external object is real. It becomes actually better to talk about the occurrence of sense contents rather than their existence. This issue of mind and matter, that is a product of metaphysical speculation regarding substances, will not apply. This will be true of both the mental object and the physical one. The continuing self will also be a logical construct out of sense experience rather than something determined a priori. Asking what the self is becomes a question of what relations must hold among different sense experiences for them to be united in the same sense history. John Locke, in his 1690 essay concerning human understanding, put later empiricists onto the question of personal identity, the question of what it means to be a particular person, and how I know that I am the same person I was yesterday. For Locke, these issues are dealt with through memory. I have the memories of being myself yesterday, living in the same place, dealing with the same people, and so on. But memory only discovers the identity that it does not produce, and not all memories are retained. Ayer instead believes he can resolve the issue by means of bodily identity. His argument for this is that if the self is a relation of sense experience that belongs to the same sense history, then it is necessary and sufficient that organic sense contents are elements of the same body. This is true because the organic sense contents cannot belong to more than one body. The embodied identity can then be thought of in terms of the resemblances and continuity of those sense contents within this sense history. In conceiving the self this way, we still produce a phenomenal self that is not deemed to be a soul that survives the destruction of the body. Ayer disputes any contention that his empiricism would commit him to accept solipsism, the doctrine that I alone exist. He argues that having a private self does not preclude the existence of other finite minds. In practice, we define another person's existence in terms of our own. I have a self that has a sense history related to my body. Other bodies like mine imply the existence of other minds when they behave in a way that a conscious being does. The existence of other minds becomes a fictitious problem. Given also that we communicate with and seem to understand each other, we can also accept that we share a common world. The way that Ayer handles the argument for the existence of other minds allows me to smoothly transition into a critical section. He does not actually argue that the existence of other minds is something he proves to be merely a reasonable or probable belief. He makes the claim to know it, with necessity, when he says, if I know that an object behaves in every way as a conscious being must, by definition, behave, then I know that it is really conscious. And this is an analytical proposition. This strikes me as a theory-laden or persuasive definition aimed at claiming that he did not make a synthetic a priori inference. If allowed, it seems to me like having a communist define communism as democracy applied to the realm of economics, and on that basis claim that the proposition that communism is democratic is a tautology. Of course, Ayer is going to want to deny engaging in metaphysics, but he is reminding me of Descartes. Descartes did not deal with the existence of other finite minds, but I can picture him making the same argument. He did say in his meditations that when he sees hats and coats in the air, he judges that men are underneath them. And I can picture him saying that when he sees a human body behaving as if it had a mind in it, he judges that a mind is within that body. I think it can be argued that Ayer went beyond his own boundaries of knowledge and meaning. As for Ayer's view on ethics, it does seem to me to flow from his premises. As to whether I would accept it, not given those premises, I have already given some commentary on similar views expressed by Hume in my video about his theory that morality is not based on reason. As for the principle of verification itself, if we accept it as true and follow its implications, we must conclude that it is itself cognitively meaningless. It is neither analytic nor empirically verifiable. This book, like Hume's inquiry before it, is full of synthetic a priori propositions from cover to cover. I would also add that if any proposition was truly meaningless in Ayer's mind, he would not profess to know if it is empirically verifiable. You might want to argue that I am needlessly nitpicking here, but Ayer is not satisfied with simply saying that propositions of metaphysics and ethics cannot be proven. He wants to make it a totally linguistic thing and ascribe lack of meaning. This is something different from merely claiming that a particular thing cannot be known. Under that scenario, I see no reason to allow for a privileged status for propositions he uses to state his views. Another problem exists regarding the desire to have propositions be meaningless instead of just unknowable, is that our sciences, especially astronomy, historically have their origins in superstitious conjectures that could not be established. Karl Popper especially made the argument that psychology is deeply mired in a lack of verifiability, but could develop later into a genuine science. Given this, if we really want to favor the development of sciences, we potentially should not write off as meaningless what cannot be demonstrated in the present. Another issue that comes up is the inclusion of historical propositions. If I want to verify that Alexander the Great did X, I could read about it in books. But this is not the same kind of empirical verification as what was available to the people of that time and place who were affected by it. However, I would defend Ayer on this point. He dealt with verifiability in theory, and it is conceivable, if not possible, that a time machine would someday be invented that would allow that verification. The point is that we know how to verify it, even if we cannot do so. I suppose the real lesson from this is that we should be more skeptical of the historical. As for the approach of analysis, it can be admitted that it has value. I have to agree that it is a proper function of philosophy to ask about what we really mean by such words as true, good, justice, and especially entity, and to ensure that our use of language is not leading us into assuming something at the beginning of the inquiry. Ayer effectively argues that it should be the whole of philosophy rather than just a part of it. That is one of the main questions, if not the main question, that each reader must think about independently in thinking through this text. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, hit those like and subscribe buttons, share it with your friends, and thanks for watching.